Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young. I'm a member of the Committee 100, and I'm also the chair of this Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative that we started in February of 2020. And we're very, very pleased to welcome you to the 28th, our 28th event since then. And very pleased to have three wonderful panelists on what is a rather important topic. I'll start out by just saying that our next one is going to be September 11th, featuring Margaret Chin, who has written a book called Stuck, which is a very interesting book, which obviously the title suggests why she's a speaker, and we hope many of you will attend that. This whole series started because there was a recognition that there's a serious problem for Asian Americans in terms of their ability to get promoted, whether it's in the corporate world, nonprofit, in politics, or in academia. And they do very well on the entry level, but as they go up in the middle ranks, so forth, they're just relatively speaking, underrepresentation as they get to very senior ranks. And so the whole idea of this whole series is to accomplish a couple things. One is to share research that's being done by respected academics and authors about the problem and why, and then to get people from different sectors and different age groups and so forth to really share their own personal stories and perspectives and lessons and advice to all of you who are in general, trying to succeed in this world. And so we hope that this event is very helpful. Before we start, I do want to say that I personally relate a lot to this, not because I'm an academic, because I'm not. I run an investment bank. It's because both of my parents were professors, and one was a chairman of his department for many years, and my wife is a professor at Columbia University, and until a year ago was the dean of one of the largest graduate schools. So I have an indirect exposure to the issue, and in spite of my father's efforts to get me to be a professor, I was able to resist that, but I was able to witness what they went through. And it is a real big issue, and it's very, very nuanced. And it's very nuanced depending upon whether you're talking about people going up in the ranks and getting promoted, or getting to the top, or being in the administrative ranks or president and so forth. And so that's part of what we're going to talk about today, which is it's not just one observation or one answer. It's very, very nuanced. So with that, the last thing I'll say, and then we'll get started, is this is a fireside chat. I'll be the moderator. I have questions that our panelists have agreed that are not too offensive, that I'll ask them. But we're going to make sure that at the end that we leave at least 10 or 15 minutes for questions from the audience. And the way you ask a question is just type it into the Q&A chat box or the regular chat box, and all of the panelists and I will be able to see the questions, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. But we're going to end promptly at the end of the hour to be respectful to everyone and their schedules. And this is being recorded, and it will be posted on the Committee of 100 website in the next couple of days. So I'd like to start out. I mean, you've all read the invitation, so you know the names of our panelists and so forth. They're very distinguished people from different organizations. I'm going to ask each one of them to take 2 or 3 minutes and tell the audience what you're currently doing, and a few insights as to how you got there. So we'll start alphabetically by last name. So Gordon, you're up first.
Thank you, Peter. This is a excellent gathering here to talk about a sensitive, nuanced, a very, very important issue about academic ceilings. I believe such ceilings do exist, have existed, and this is a vital issue to address regarding hiring, promotion, advancement, and another issue is salaries. So let me just say who I am. I have varied perspectives on this topic going back through my whole career. I went to undergraduate, so I've seen this issue from various vantage points. As an undergraduate, I went to Princeton. I got my graduate degree at Stanford. I taught at a community college in Oakland for some years. I also taught in the UC system, and I've been at Stanford now for 30 years as a professor of history, and recently as the senior associate vice provost for undergraduate education. Now, when I assumed that position, I'll just jump to the end. I became in Stanford's history the highest ranking Asian American in the administration of, in the Stanford's administration, other than a fellow who just stepped down, who headed the Stanford, what's used to be called the Stanford Linear Accelerator, SLAC, a physicist, noted physicist. But in the long history of Stanford and the number of students that we have of Asian ancestry, now over 22%, the number of faculty that we have, number in the hundreds, particularly in engineering, medical school, and then the other schools, including business school, education, and humanities and sciences, and business, we have had a glaring absence of administrators. And so it was, I assumed the position as the SA VPUE out of obligation, I felt, on my part, to try to break through that ceiling. And I still feel and firmly believe that Stanford has a big problem. We won't talk about this big problem that's in the news the past couple of days, yesterday, today, but with regard to representation in its higher, despite the fact that Stanford has a reputation of being a liberal institution, as most institutions of higher education have. I'll end there by saying that when you look back on the history of higher education, it's notable the absence of leadership in higher education of Asian Americans.
Okay. So Guiyu Huang, could you tell the audience what you do and sort of how you got there?
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor to join distinguished fellow panelists like Frank and Gordon. Thank you, Peter, for organizing this. I am serving as the president of Western Illinois University, located in Macomb, a nice small town in obviously Western Illinois. I've been enjoying my life here. So I have degrees in English, 2 of them in China, 1 of them in the States. How I got here is really I took the very traditional path of being an academic, being a professor, moving up to being a chair for department, then director of a college, then dean of a division in a private university, then a vice presidency, eventually a chancellorship, and now in a presidential position at a different university. Like Gordon said, I do believe there are some issues there with regard to Asian American career setting. I came from China a long time ago, and the first time I heard about Asian American career setting was when I believe Berkeley had its first chancellor in a Chinese American. That was when I heard that expression. And knowing that, of course, I came from China when I was an adult. So now, having been through the ranks at several universities, wherever you are, however you look at it, and there are some issues there we can explore, we can help find answers to. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Frank.
Frank, go ahead.
Great. Hi, folks. How's everyone? So I will explain what I do now and then how I got here. And let me start with what I do now. I'm the president of Queens College. We are about 20,000 students located in the world's borough in Flushing. which if you haven't been there in the past generation, it's become the new Chinatown. You take the 7 train, you get off, and it's actually not just people from China. It's people who are Korean American, Filipino. It's people from the mainland, from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, mixing and mingling. So even though it's heavily Asian, and in particular East Asian, it's unlike anything in Asia because of the mixture. Now, the City University of New York system, it's the largest urban public system in the entire nation. 25 institutions altogether, all located in New York City. Started in 1847. I was appointed a little more than 3 years ago. I'm now in my 4th year. And when I was named to head Queens College, I was the first Asian American ever to be named to that role, and the second Asian American in the CUNY system. Actually, let me explain that. There was a conference held about 7 years ago. The CUNY system has an Asian American and Asian Research Institute. And the woman who headed that, Joyce Moy, I always acknowledge I wouldn't be here if it weren't for her advocacy. She looked around and she said, wait a minute. The system was founded in 1847. Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial minority group. New York City has the greatest concentration of Asian Americans, yet there's never been a college president nor a vice chancellor in all of CUNY of Asian descent. And so she started to advocate. She enlisted faculty, staff, and students. And I know that I wouldn't be here if there weren't consideration of diversity. I think it's so important to say that with the recent Supreme Court cases. And I put out a very personal statement about those cases, and someone read a draft and said, you know, you don't want people to think you're unqualified. I said, no, the point here is I am qualified, but I wouldn't have been considered, because unless you're actually looking to reach out and to overcome bias, not just the explicit egregious type, but the implicit subtle bias, you're not going to look at people who don't look like the people that you've previously seen in that role. And to CUNY's credit, they hired 2 Asian Americans in a single cycle. I was still a candidate, and I saw on the news that Baruch College, which is over in Manhattan, it's business focused, that a fellow named David Wu, who I knew a little bit, had been named for that role. And I hadn't yet gotten the call from the chancellor of the system. And I said to my wife, well, you know, that's it. They're never going to hire me, because they hired an Asian American. They didn't just hire an Asian American, he's Chinese American. He came and his name is Wu. You know, they're not going to hire 2 guys named Wu in the same cycle. But a couple weeks later, the chancellor gave me a call and said, you know, we'd like to offer you this role at Queens College. I point that out because it's to the credit of the CUNY system. This was not about tokenism. David is the right person for his job. I'm the right person for my job. And I always explain that doesn't mean I'm the best person. I'm the person for this place and this time. If you have a search where there's only one candidate who's the best, you didn't run a good search. This is about choice. You should have multiple good, excellent candidates, and then you pick the one who will take you in the direction that you want to go in. I'll be very brief and say I also came up in a different way. I have a traditional academic background. I have been a professor. I've been a dean. I was chancellor and dean of a unique University of California campus. That's a standalone law school. But I got my beginning at Howard University, and I am proud of that. That's the nation's leading historically Black institution of higher education. I spent a decade there. So I came from a predominantly Black background. That is not common, to come from a historically Black institution of higher education and to end up heading a predominantly white institution of higher education. And I owe my entire career, and I want to acknowledge that, to what happened and how much I learned at an institution that was founded with a mission, which was to uplift a people. So back to you, Peter.
Well, Frank, I'm very disappointed. I thought you would say that you got the job because of the letter of recommendation that you had me write.
Yes, that too. That's very important.
So now the next one, and it's great to hear the backgrounds and from the 3 of you, and we've got 3 very different, you know, careers and trajectories. So that's what makes it interesting as a panel. You know, when we started out, and I think Gordon, you said the same thing, that, you know, it's very nuanced. there is a kind of problem, but there's a lot of debate about how big a problem and where is it and so forth. So I'd like each of you or whoever wishes to speak to say, is there any meaningful segmentation about this issue? In other words, is it a bigger problem in promotions? Is it a bigger problem in salary and so forth? Where are the problems particularly bad, with regard to Asian Americans succeeding in academia? And I'm not going to pick order, so it's really up to the panelists what you want to say.
I'll chime in on a couple of words. You could say it's segmented. You could say it's across the board. From my perspective, it's hard to quantify. I do think of this problem in such a way. Are we looking at Asian American faculty in the teaching ranks, or staff working in a university unit, or faculty or staff looking to climb the career ladder? What are we looking at? From my viewpoint, there are a lot of Asian American faculty in universities of this country, whether it's Western Illinois or a CUNY campus or a campus in California. There are a good number of them, Asian Americans, teaching. But the same cannot be said of higher ranking administrators in the universities, whether, again, it's a research flagship campus or a regional teaching campus or even a community college.
Yeah. And why is that, do you think? What do you think is driving that?
I'll try to answer that question. People with a doctoral degree wanting to get into an academic career, of course, they would go to a university to teach. So that's where the career, certainly mine, that's where my career started. I taught in China in 2 different universities in China. When I came here, became a student. After that, the only viable option is to look for a job in teaching. In my case, though, was not always easy because I had a degree in English. As a foreigner with a sojourner stereotype, speaking English with an accent, can you find a job teaching English in the United States? That was one of my challenges. I thought this country was great. I still think this is a great country because despite all the issues we have, people are willing to give you a chance at a career, whether it's teaching or something else. In the end, I spent 2 years teaching as a lecturer at a research university before I landed a tenure track job at a teaching comprehensive university. So that's the natural path. There are people in sciences, in engineering, in social sciences. They may have had a different experience landing a tenure track or non-tenure track teaching job, but it is a permanent job. It provides job security, provides a salary, and you get satisfaction out of teaching at a university.
Gordon, you mentioned earlier that you thought, you'd had the different categories and administrators, so forth. So any comments on where you see the problem the greatest, or maybe it's across the board a problem?
Oh, it's hard. It's Guiyu mentioned it. It's a little hard to quantify. Let me give you an example. Let's just talk about, I mentioned salaries. I think it's very difficult. Maybe Guiyu he has access to salary information, but at Stanford, we don't. And Frank probably does too. I'm sure he does too. But I suspect that if we were able to do a sociological survey, we would find that faculty, and there are growing numbers, it's undeniable, of faculty in institutions of higher education that's in the United States, is that compared to other categories, whites, blacks, Latino, Asian Americans, my bet, I'm just not even speculating, but my bet is that Asian Americans are at the lowest for all the ranks. We in some ways, it's a paradox because there are more of us, particularly compared to our presence in the population, but we're the lowest paid. And particularly Asian females are often, when we do have data, are really low. So if you compare, I will say this, the number of Asian ancestry students in higher education the number of faculty, the number of graduate students compared to the number of administrators at all ranks, there's been an enormous disparity, gap of representation between the big numbers on the former and the low numbers, relatively low numbers, although they're also changing in the leadership positions and promotions.
Well, what do you think is driving that? So let's take each of the two. You made 2 points. One is salary discrimination, and the other is ability to get up the ranks into the senior administrative positions. Although I've been told being promoted to provost may not be the most wonderful job in the world, given all the things you have to deal with, right? But tell me, what do you think is the cause of that? It may be different, quite different by salary versus, raising the ranks on the administrative side.
Well, I'll just say quickly, I think there are two sides. One is, if you will, our side. We are the subjects. That is, we can explain something, I think, by looking at ourselves, our personalities, our behavior, our trajectories, our generation, our subject material, and so forth. So that's what's sort of under our control. But then there's the environment or the context, and that's the big social context. So I think there are things to discuss in both sides of things that can explain, speak to this issue on our side, and issues that can speak to this on the environmental or condition or contextual side. Yeah.
Frank, you comment on whether there are differences and why?
Sure. It's so hard for Asian Americans to articulate this because people look and they say, wait a minute, there's so many Asian American undergraduate students. There's so many Asian American assistant professors. And yes, it is true that if you were to look at highly selective institutions of higher education at the undergraduate level and compare to a baseline of the general population, it's just statistically the case. Asian Americans are overrepresented. It also is true that if you were to take a look at entry-level hiring, in particular in STEM fields, into faculty roles, Asian Americans are overrepresented relative to the proportion of the general population. That's almost always using the wrong baseline, because the baseline should never be the general population. It's the pool of people qualified. But what everyone's getting at is, as soon as you move up the ranks, and this is not my opinion, this is demonstrably true. We live in a world where people don't care about evidence and facts anymore, but it's just true that Asian Americans are underrepresented at the dean, provost, president, and chancellor level, even relative to the overall population, but especially relative to the population of people who are qualified. So some people have said, oh, Asian Americans aren't interested. That's false. That's a stereotype. We actually have a faculty member who studies this. She's looked at engineers. She's looked at professors. Asian Americans, just like everyone else, want to be in charge. I mean, the same proportion. Not everyone wants to be in charge. There are some people who are Asian American, just as there are some people who are white or black who don't want a job such as provost or president. Entirely understandable. So why is it so hard? It's so hard because people have this fear Asian Americans are taking over, right? That's the classic yellow peril. How come Asian Americans are getting all the scholarships? Why? Where are the real Americans? And when you articulate this, there's also a concern from other minority groups, because if you accept this argument, then what is being pointed out is that Asian Americans are disadvantaged even relative to other people of color. And that's also true. There's a fellow named Buck G. Some of you may know him. He's a Committee of 100 member. You can Google this. He had an article in Harvard Business Review about 5 years ago, and he demonstrated statistically Asian Americans are underrepresented in management roles, even at Silicon Valley tech corporations. So if you were to ask, is it true? It's just demonstrably true. There are far fewer Asian Americans in leadership roles than you would expect in the absence of bias. I'll just add one more thing. Gordon mentioned some of this is external. I don't want anyone to make any mistake about what I'm saying. There is bias But among friends, I want to say there are also a set of behaviors that Asian Americans themselves engage in. Let me give you an example. My parents, I would come home, this is 50 years ago, and I'd say I'd face the common cruelty of childhood bullying on the playground, racialized teasing and taunting, being called chink and jap and gook. And I use those words to show they have no power over me. My parents would say, try harder. And that's so much of the sentiment. Put your head down and work harder. And part of the problem, yes, we should work hard, but no amount of hard work overcomes other people's prejudice. It just makes them more resentful because you're showing them up. And it sort of shows you'll take the abuse and not stand up and speak out. So there is a set of behaviors, and I actually wrote an essay. The title is in jest, but I wrote an essay that's coming out in a book entitled Everything My Asian Immigrant Parents Taught Me Turns Out to Be Wrong. And part of what I want to argue is Asian Americans have to be more assertive. It doesn't mean that you have to be obnoxious. And there are different adaptations. But some of what's going on, I wonder if maybe Asian Americans have used a set of strategies that might not well serve them if you are trying to be a leader. Because being a leader is not about what your SAT score was. It's about people skills, entirely different skill set.
Well, I'm very glad you didn't say anything negative about Buck G because he's in the audience, by the way.
All right, I gave Buck a shout out.
If you want to butter up Buck G, just say a few more nice things about him. Now, it's very interesting to look at where the current trends are, and also compare against other groups. And if you look, whether it's Asian Americans or you look at women or blacks or whatever, you can make some interesting observations. One thing I want to make, and I want to really ask your opinion, is there's certainly a surge among the recently appointed presidents of Ivy League schools. There was an unusual amount of turnover the last couple of years, so Harvard had to replace, et cetera. But for the most part, they were all replaced with women. Columbia University, Harvard, so forth, right? And some people said, well, is that really now a good trend that there's a surge to, try to correct the imbalance that existed for women in terms of being leaders of universities? But I also noticed recently that, in fact, there's been a little bit of surge, maybe not a huge surge, in the number of Asian Americans who have become heads of universities. Do you think that there's any relationship, is any lesson from that, or is it not true? I do know that one thing that's happened is now there's a new organization of Asian American presidents of universities, right, that has been formed. There are enough so you could actually have a group, which is always positive. So do you see, is there any observation about that? Do you think that there's any relationship? Do you think that somehow there's a corrective mechanism that's happening, at least in terms of being the presidents of colleges? Anyone can answer.
I'll go ahead. Absolutely, there's change. Some of this, though, is when you go from 1 to 2, you've doubled your numbers, though you're just going from 1 to 2. So there's been huge change, just a wave of hiring because people have become just much more aware of these issues. And in a terrible way, all the anti-Asian violence during the pandemic made people aware of Asian Americans and made people aware that Asian Americans face issues. And Asian Americans said, well, yes, this has been going on for the entire time that there have been Asian Americans. Other people just haven't been aware of it. So, the violence wasn't new. It was greatly increased, but the awareness was new. So people are suddenly aware of Asian Americans in a way that it just weren't before. And that, for the most part, is positive. Some of it generates backlash, where people worry about the rise of the East, the decline of the West, global competition, China versus the United States, and all of that, and where do Asian Americans fit in. But yes, statistically, there's been a huge change just in the past 5 years, in the blink of an eye.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention, in addition to what Frank said, which I agree, there seems to be a much greater self-awareness amongst the Asian Americans in recent decade that I have been watching, the desire to go up higher, to be involved, to be recognized for their achievements. Right? Asians are often called overachievers. In what way do we overachieve? Do we really overachieve? Higher SAT score, a better ranking college, or higher salary? What does that mean? So Peter, I'm not sure what organization you were referencing earlier, a college, Asian American presidents of college and university. Do you have the exact name? Because I was thinking about the Council of Chinese American Deans and Presidents that consists of mostly, even not exclusively, I think, deans, associate deans, vice president, and presidents that are Chinese American, but they almost all came from China. That started in 2006. I became a member in 2006 or 7. They started in 2005. That group has been very dynamic. They are working on a book, and some of us are included, that will be published very soon in Europe on the rise of Asian American leaders in higher education. Right? Also, talking to faculty in the workplaces I've had, a small number of Asian American faculty or Chinese American faculty, they ask questions about advancement opportunities. How did you do it? How should I do it? How can I learn? But sadly, it's always a very, very small number. The comforting news is, small as it is, and there are Asian Americans who are asking these questions who wanted to move ahead.
Yeah, and I do think one of the problems, if you look across all the topics we've been dealing with for these events, not academic, but in corporate, whatever, one distinctive thing is that in general, Asian Americans don't form groups to try to, as a group, try to address a problem and try to correct it. They work more individually, more siloed. One exception is Indian Americans, who, if you look at the last 5-10 years, they've been very good at forming groups to fund political candidates, et cetera, and get people into higher ranks. And it's part of the reason why so many Indian Americans are CEOs of major companies. You look, there's less of that among East Asian, though. If you look, there are few collective groups, and I think that's that's part of the issue, right? And maybe something that we should all think about, whether it's academia or whether it's generally in politics or in the corporate world, trying to find ways to work together more collectively and with other groups, right? There's nothing wrong with trying to get help from the Jewish American or African American community and help each other.
Yeah. I agree with you, Peter. But let me return to this approach, thinking about this question.
Yeah.
From the angles, ourselves, and then the context of the environment. One is ourselves. I agree with the observation that there's been I think, significant change of attitude, behavior on our part over the past 10 to 15 years. And this goes back in part to Buck, who was a pioneer and calling attention to this, and particularly his attention, as I understand, of looking at our own values of behavior and how we are perceived, and how we can start by changing ourselves. And I think just this gathering here is evidence of the changing attitude that we need to be more self-assertive, to talk about problems, to talk about solutions, to be more aggressive, and to put it in a simple way. I'm reminded of a story. I won't use his name. He's a very accomplished attorney, and now I'll say the Supreme Court judge in a state. So very accomplished. And he went to top schools. And when he got this job offer at a high firm, he called up one of his Asian American mentors in law school. He said, do you think I'm really qualified? You really actually take this job? And the mentor shot back to him and he said, enough of this humble Asian shit. You just take that damn job. What do you want? And he talks about this anecdote, and everyone laughs because it really touches his nerve. There's this sort of, Frank talked about something, but this side of humility, whether it's real or not, I think that's there is something there on how we behave, and it's not, and I think this is again demonstrated, inconsistent with certain traditional perceptions of what a leader is in American life. A leader is X, Y, Z, has these personality traits. This affected college admissions, this is college advance, all sorts of things where Asians sort of don't come up to the traditional standards or values that are something. Now those are changing. So
Right.
I think that's one. So there's internal and external. The other external issue, which I don't mean to be cynical about this, is that we have a much greater Asian American population generally, and a much wealthier population, and a population that's donating more. And institutions of higher education, particularly private ones, but also public ones, the president, and it should be said that presidents have a variety of functions. They're not all the same. And private institutions like at Stanford, almost the sole job of the president is to raise money.
Yeah.
And that's a really key consideration of hiring committee. And I think as we go forward, institutions are aware of this in addition to the issues of equity and representation, and just personal excellence.
By the way, I'm going to quote my father, who a number of you know, because he was a member of the Committee 100. And he said to me, I want you to be a professor, but I want to explain to you that once you get to the top ranks, it's a tough job. And I said, well, why? He said, just imagine trying to persuade a tenured professor to do something that they don't want to do. You can't change your salary, you can't fire them, so forth. So there's an example of how tough it is to be in the senior ranks. And he said, then if you thought that was bad, just try managing the students. That's even worse. So he said, I just want to be very specific. I'd like you to be a professor, but I hope you don't become a chairman or a president for your health. One question I have is, and this was mentioned by a number of you, which is this issue about the recent problems about Asia hate, but also in particular about the accusations against Chinese or Chinese American scientists and so forth, right? Do you think that has had, either of those two has had an impact on this issue in terms of advancing in the academic world along all dimensions, whether it's a promotion to administrative positions or getting tenure or whatever it is? Any comment?
Sure, I'll speak to that. I'm going to give you 3 examples. First, as to the very specific issue you mentioned, one of the jobs I have is approving of foreign visitors. And something that has happened just recently is an increased scrutiny and a set of protocols in an effort to ferret out and fight and prevent and respond to espionage and theft and double dipping, whatever else. And so some activities which even 10 years ago were being promoted, right, such as partnership, now are regarded as suspect, if not criminal. One of the things I realized early on, and let me be absolutely clear, I'm against espionage, I'm against theft, but I believe that the efforts to fight those will be helped by not engaging in racial profiling. So I realize that I'm now in a decision-making role. I have authority and I want to do something that is different. I do not want to behave just like the next person who might have implicit bias. And so when I see these cases, I read the file, and if the file is only based on guilt by association, so-and-so from China is associated with such and such institution, and there's nothing about that individual, I am not going to engage in what I would regard to be improper stereotyping, even at the behest of funders or others who might wish. Now, they would never admit that it's bigotry. They would say, no, that's not what it is. But in my view, that is what it is. And so I recognize that this is all around us. I'll give you an example of something. A few hours ago, just today, I was talking to someone on the faculty, so someone I outrank, who's white. And we're trying to put on a program with a speaker about the Japanese-American internment during World War II, when 120,000 people, 2/3 of them US citizens, were locked up. And we were trying to figure out what professors would be interested in working with this speaker. And the professor I was talking to framed this as something related to Asia, not domestic US history. And throughout all these names of people who do work on Asia, and in what I hope was a gentle and appropriate way, I said, well, actually, this is about US history. It's not actually about Asian history. The internment of Japanese Americans was not carried out by Japan. It was not carried out against Japanese foreign nationals overseas. 1/3 of the people were Japanese immigrants barred from naturalizing because of a color line that existed then. The third and final example I'll give you is constantly, even with people I regard as friends, as allies, as professionals who have, I want to be clear, these are not bigots. These are well-meaning people. Some of them regard themselves as having a strong civil rights background, but when they talk about who has privilege, when they talk about who needs help, the way they talk, sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's implicit, but it's just as clear. They don't regard Asian Americans as people who need help, either because they think they're perpetual foreigners or they believe in the model minority myth. They're all crazy rich Asians. So when I talk to people about the students who are deserving of intervention and who need assistance, I try not to seem self-interested. This is about principles, right? I try to gently nudge folks into seeing that Asian Americans are indeed American and that Asian Americans need help and are racial minorities and that they're deserving. Some of this isn't just the assumption that every Asian American, is a whiz kid rocket scientist with perfect test scores. Some of it, I think, underneath is also the sense that Asian Americans don't have the same claim. They don't have the same priority. They don't deserve the public attention. Even with all the violence that occurred during the pandemic, somehow Asian Americans are regarded as outside of our circle of sympathy.
And that's certainly true that there are a lot of other ethnic groups that don't understand that the discrimination against Asian Americans, Chinese Americans have been really, really tough. Whether it's how they were treated when they were building the railroads to the Exclusion Act, and there's just not an awareness of how severe those things were. Gordon or Guiyu, any comment about this issue about?
Quickly, I'm sorry, quickly, you go back to 1924 when the Exclusion Act happened, and look at now 2023, right? Just about 100 years ago, how much progress has been made or not made? What is happening? It's not what is happening to Asian American, but what has been happening to America as a country that symbolizes the freedom, symbolizes a lot of opportunities. I mean, look at that 100-year of history, you can draw a lot of conclusions, whether or not we like them. That aside, I wanted to make a similar, related but different point. Asian Americans or Chinese Americans, I'm looking at three large categories, actually. One, those who are born here, the ABCs, right? American-born Chinese, for example, like most of you, naturally have a natural grasp and understanding of American culture, American politics, American geography, you name it. And then there is a second group who are, I would call, cultural Americans or Chinese or Asian Americans. They came when they are 5, 6, 7, 8, or even 18 or 19. They also have a different mindset than those who came as adults. Those who, the latter category, the students from China or Taiwan or India, they came in their 20s or 30s. That's a very different group, speaking a different English as well. Now, I happen to be convinced speaking English with an accent is a cause for racial discrimination. If you open your mouth, they hear accent, somehow you would be treated differently. At least I experienced that in very subtle ways. One reason I have been emphasizing the importance of fighting not only overt open racism, but subtle covert racism, because that's harder to detect, therefore harder to combat. And yet you feel it, you see it every day. That is an obstacle, that is a barrier to career advancement of many, many Asian Americans. So when you speak with an accent, somehow you lose some credibility as a Chinese American or the Asian American, or you lack some qualification to be a leader. That partly answers one of the questions I saw in the Q&A.
No, we'll get to that later. Gordon, any comment about this?
Yeah, I want to say quite forcefully that I think we here might be underestimating the damage of the deteriorating U.S.-China relationship has had on Chinese ancestry academics.
Mhm.
I think it's been enormous. Now, we know, I think among us and those in the room, that there have been a slew of cases brought by the Justice Department, FBI, against a number of Chinese ancestry engineers and scientists. That has thrown a really heavy blanket over the scientific engineering community. It just deters people. You know, the message is shut up, do your own work, and don't give any reason for people to suspect you, which also means don't take any leadership positions, don't stand out, don't be prominent.
That's
And I
right.
think this is now what's happened. Hundreds, as I understand, of academics, Chinese ancestry academics, have returned to China. So we don't even have them anymore, or graduate students, certainly. So they're just leaving. So we don't even have them in the pipeline. Second, those in place, I think, have been significantly affected by this climate. I know and I know for a fact that Stanford, a number of my colleagues, brilliant colleagues, young colleagues, mid-career, have now all stepped back. They're not going to be prominent. Some of them, I know one brilliant computer engineer who's one of the leaders, brought into leadership, and then this whole China initiative came up, and she became the target of all sorts of crap, of threats against her, China spy, and all this. And now she's sort of disappeared. She was in line to become a top leader. Steve Chu, my colleague, a physicist, Nobel Prize winner, was Livermore Lab. You know, he's one of the few who's spoken out, but he's Chinese American. He's a Nobel Prize winner. He has, highest level. He was in the White House, so he's spoken up quite forcefully about this. But I know among many others here at Stanford have all stepped back. And the most tragic example of this is my colleague of about 8 years ago, who committed suicide, who was a physicist, who was doing all the things that we were talking about here of helping engage in collaboration and great success. He was rumored to be in line for a Nobel Prize. And then the spotlight shone on him, including from my institution here, Hoover, began to focus on him. And for reasons both personal and I think professional, I can't prove it, jumped off a condo in San Francisco, killed himself. We know this is all going on, and I think it's been just tragic.
So unfortunately, it's going to make what is a challenge in terms of career ceilings even more challenging. And it's going to last for a while, because I think the tension between the US and China is not going to disappear very soon. And sadly, it's being directed at not just Chinese Americans, but Japanese Americans and Indian Americans, and so forth, because a lot of the people, they just don't see the difference between being Chinese or Japanese or Korean. So it's a big problem, and it won't go away real soon.
It's the which side are you on? Even if you are native born. So I'm a kid from Detroit. My Mandarin is embarrassingly bad to my own relatives. You face this. So speaking of accents, we all have accents. I have a Midwestern American accent, and that's exactly what you would expect given where I grew up. But I've had people tell me that I have a strong Chinese accent, which just strikes me as absurd that anyone would think that, but somehow they're perceiving it because of color of skin, texture of hair, or shape of eyes. And even if you're native born, I am trolled on social media fairly regularly by people who accuse me of being a Chinese spy or Chinese foreign agent. And if you do anything related to civil rights, you get more of that grief, because then people say, oh, you're just woke, and you're using that argument because you're a spy, and the way you're trying to hide that you're a spy is by invoking these American ideals. It's you can't win for trying. No matter how much you assimilate, it's regarded as a trick. You're trying too hard, right? And the very act of trying to assimilate shows that you're submitting to your social superiors, who will judge you.
Okay, so now we have a lot of questions here. We've got 10 questions and so forth. So what I'm going to do is, I was going to ask the last question, which is, what advice would you give? But one of the attendees asked the question, so I'll start out with that. So Kai says, what actionable advice would you have for Asian Americans at the assistant professor level for career advancement? And I would, expand that to just generally trying to rise up in the ranks of the academia in general. So any of you on the panel wish to answer that?
I'll go and give my colleagues a little more time to think. I'll give you 3 responses. The first is find allies. You can't do this by yourself. Build your network, reach out, find yourself a mentor. People generally respond well when you say, hey, I admire you. Will you mentor me? And if it's someone who you are connected to somehow, 2 steps removed, maybe you can have someone introduce you. So number 1, find allies. Number 2, push out of your comfort zone. For too many, and I'm going to stereotype, and I know this is a stereotype and it's crude, but I think for many Asian Americans, it's about grades and test scores. When I was in high school, I got myself a student government role in high school 50 years ago, 40 years ago. My parents said, you have to resign so that you can study hard to get into a good college. Little did they know, being in student government would have helped me get into a good college and would have helped me, more importantly, develop skills. Push out of your comfort zone. No one cares that you got a perfect SAT score. They're not going to make you chair of the department, a dean, a provost, or a president because of your grades. That's not what it's about. It's about a different skill set, and one that for many Asian Americans was not emphasized. Deference to your elders and modesty, humility, great traits. They're not going to get you these leadership roles in general. And when you emphasize your accomplishments that way, you look self-interested, selfish. This is about what can you do to help others, to help the institution, and touting yourself. So some Asian Americans try to learn how to be aggressive, but they get it wrong, right? And they just come across as, let me tell you how great I am, and that's why I deserve this promotion. That's not going to get you the promotion. The third thing that I would say is you have to stand up and speak out. And that's incredibly uncomfortable for many people. But if you're, and that doesn't mean you have to be loud. You can be quiet and effective, but you can't be passive. You can't sit there. That's not what a leader does. So I'll give you an example of something concrete you can learn to do. Incredibly hard. Every college president can do this. And it's learnable behavior. Learn how to work a room. Learn how to talk to strangers. You should be able to walk into a room with 100 people who all know each other. You don't know anyone, and walk up to one of them at a cocktail party with a plate of food and just strike up conversation. And boy, is that hard and awkward. But the most difficult part is overcoming what's inside you, to be willing to do that. And the second time you do that, it's easier, and then it becomes natural. One of the things I'm required to do, I go to funeral services of people I don't know. They're grieving, and I'm an institutional representative, and I need to behave with empathy and appropriately. Boy, is that hard. If you can't do that, you can learn how to do it, and you need to if you want to be a leader in these roles.
And I'm glad you mentioned mentorship, because through all of these events, and whether we talk about technology industry, media, law, whatever, the most common thing that people say is that Asian Americans don't develop mentorships enough, and waiting around for mentors who are Asian American, you might be waiting for a while, right? Because if it's a self-fulfilling problem. So that's the number one. So I'm glad, Frank, you mentioned, because the reality is you could be great, but you have to have someone rooting for you, right? Gordon, do you have a comment?
Yeah. From my own personal experience, and I concur completely about finding mentors, but also turning the spotlight on ourselves and our own behavior, and to adjust. For years, decades, I ate the humble shit. I did my work. I did outstanding work. And I think I assumed that because I did, somebody was going to come along and say, oh, you're doing such great work, Gordon. We want you to be in this position. Well, that person never came calling. Eventually someone did. But then I went to someone along this time and I said, look, I think I'm being underpaid. And they said, well, go talk to somebody about it. Mm-hmm. I can do that. Things like even small things such as that, finding ways to advocate for oneself. That is to talk to senior people. You don't have to be abrasive or something, but you compare yourself to others and to see what others are doing or getting, and advocate for yourself in some, substantial, some proven way. Now, finding ways to somehow present yourself, and I think this is reflective of some of the questions, is how do you present yourself? I think it is an issue of how can we, and I've said this, how can I better serve the institution? If we really respect and appreciate the institution we're in, you can say, look, I think I can do more for this institution. I would like to do, like the chair of the department, serve on committees, or do this, and not wait for someone to kind of come along and tap me on the shoulder.
Yeah, I think that's right. Guiyu, do you have any comment?
Yeah, I think both gentlemen made great points. No reason to repeat. I want to add one other point to answer that question. To be a good citizen of your department, to be a good colleague, meaning to be involved in the life of the department, in the life of the university, and also in the life of the community. Why is that important? Why is involvement important? You build relationships, you build a record of success, you build a record of your ability to be a leader. So that in that process, you get to be seen. We talked already about Asian stereotypical Asian modesty or humbleness or humility. That can be an obstacle to Asian American success. You can be humble, you may have a humility, a lot of it in the end. That wouldn't help you a whole lot. To be visible, to be involved, to create a record, that will be helpful.
Now, we have one question here that's not directly part of this, but is in the news. So Mary Del Chu says, first sentence is about her being Chinese Filipino, but the second part is, are we okay with the academia decision, which is not really the academia decision, but I guess the Supreme Court decision, to cancel racial-based consideration to be accepted in the university. So this is this affirmative action thing that happened recently. So it's off target, but on the other hand, it is sort of on target, because some of these same issues deal with how decisions are made about promotion and so forth too. It's not just, who gets into Stanford or whatever, right? So can anyone comment? One, do you have any opinion about the most recent Supreme Court decision? But the other is, do you think that issue itself, right, which is using race as a way of maybe promoting a certain social or a mix of people, do you think that is or is not relevant to issues that we're talking about today, which is succeeding in the academic world as an Asian American?
Yeah, I'll give three responses. The first is, I want to be absolutely clear. I fight bias against Asian Americans. I've no doubt Asian Americans have faced bias. I have no doubt Asian Americans continue to face bias, but fighting bias against Asian Americans does not mean blaming African Americans and diversity programs for that bias. What has happened is the big lie. When Asian Americans have faced bias, people have said, oh, well, hey, Asians, you should be mad at African Americans in affirmative action. The reason we have to discriminate against you is to help African Americans. That makes no sense at all. If you actually think about what's going on, what's happening is Asian Americans are being squeezed out to help whites. That's really what's going on. It's just straight up anti-Asian bias. Let's fight anti-Asian bias, but that doesn't mean attacking African Americans. And it just pains me when I'm in settings where there are Asian Americans who are, let me be blunt, Asian supremacists, whose view is, yeah, we really are smarter, we really are harder working, and if other people were like us, they'd be okay. I'm just, that's reprehensible. Second, the Supreme Court acknowledges and has preserved diversity as a compelling state interest. All they've done is they've said you cannot use race as a factor. You can still pursue the overall goal. You just need a different means to do that. And focusing on affirmative action, and I say this as someone who's testified in Congress, was an expert witness in the Michigan case, is the wrong focus. The real question is, what are the goals that we share as a consensus, and then what action will we take? Do we actually believe in diversity? Some people do, some people don't. Some institutions do, some don't. Some people say they do, but take no action. So when you talk about it that way, then the challenge facing everyone right now who cares about this is, what is the alternative that is legal and legal and race neutral that we will adopt? Do people have the courage to take risks so that I don't expose myself to litigation? We will comply with the Supreme Court decision, but the Supreme Court decision provides wide berth for appropriate means to ensure a diverse class. Third, and finally, the court did not actually address the issue of anti-Asian bias. Exactly as people suggested, Asian Americans were pawns. They were used to advance an ideological cause and to strike down affirmative action. But it was not because Asian Americans, in the Supreme Court's ruling, were facing discrimination. So that issue was not squarely addressed by a majority of the court. And if you actually look at how they defined Asian Americans, they left out all of the Asian Americans who were beneficiaries of any diversity program. That was in the way that they brought the litigation. They said, we will define Asian Americans to exclude all these Asian Americans. Really just amazing.
Any comments from our other two panelists as we end this program?
I'll just say I agree very much with what Frank said. I think the Supreme Court decision, and I'm appalled by the decision, but the Supreme Court decision, along with what's going on in Florida and all this attack on so-called woke culture and all across the board. So there's a whole social environment now which is turning against the value explicit of diversity. And say that somehow this is bad, this is woke, this is political, and I think that is going to affect us. And it's going to affect the whole academic atmosphere. It's going to make it very conservative, and any indication of something about diversity going too far, including considering Asians, Americans in different positions, is going to be raised. So it's a part, the Supreme Court decision was part of a broad onslaught against diversity.
Well, first of all, I want to thank our panelists. I mean, this has been a lively, very helpful discussion. So I want to thank all three of you. And the other is, we want to thank the audience. We had some really good questions. Many of them, by the way, were just more a statement of a particular opinion. So, I'll just let the panelists read those and so forth. And I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of the actual questions. I want to end by saying there are two things. One is there is September 11th, we have Margaret Chin, who wrote the book Stuck. We also will continue to have these sessions. but also we're planning on having a combined in-person hybrid event late fall, where we're going to do two things: try to get all the heads of these different organizations to get together and talk about what they're doing and to see how they can collaborate more. But the second half is going to be getting many of you together to really talk about solutions, and then trying to get people to find each other to work together on particular problems, because we're really trying to pivot as much as we can to action-oriented activities, because I think we've really gone through a lot of the explaining the problem and why and advice. So I want to thank all of you. Again, this is recorded. It'll be on the Committee 100 website in the next couple of days. And I really want to thank our three panelists who did an outstanding job of really addressing this very important question about academic obstacles. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everybody.
Well,
Good night.